Hey guys, this is Ben from Skillard, and I'm going to be installing some 4.5-inch Speedhut gauges into my S30 280Z. Just wanted to go over a few of the things that I found during the install, and a few techniques that I found online that I wasn't necessarily thrilled with, but I think would work. And then a bracket that I fabricated to help make this, in my opinion, a lot easier and cleaner installation. They'll be available from Skillard.com. However, if you find that some of the other techniques that I mentioned will suit your needs, then by all means you can give that a try. So the first thing was taking out the old gauges, and there's a screw. You can kind of see the light through the hole right here. There's a screw in the front that you got to pull out, and then down around on the back on this tab there's another screw that's underneath that you got to pull out, and then obviously unplug the wiring, and then the gauges will slide out the front. This is from a 280. I understand that on some of the earlier Z's it might look a little bit different. So once it's out, most of them should have this tape around the edge. So I went ahead and peeled this tape off. Then there's 2 Phillips screws on each side. Use a regular screwdriver, but I like the impact. Pop these guys out. Then from there, the gauge should slide out of the housing, like so. So this one's the tack. With the Speedhut gauges, you can probably see on this one that it's got the button down there that you want to be able to access. So what I'm going to be doing is taking the plastic lens out and not reusing it. However, this piece here that backs in, I'm going to slide back inside this housing. So I've seen a few techniques where guys will just take the 4.5-inch gauge, actually just put silicone or some kind of adhesive, and they'll actually set the gauge in, let it set, and install it in the car. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy, but not something that I wanted to do with my new Speedhut gauge. The other thing that I've seen is with your existing housing, you disassemble this, you pull all this out, you get all the wires, and there's actually, you can see it on this this one here, there's some little cylindrical tubes that are on the inside that will be in the way, so you either got to drill out the spot welds or cut them out, try to pull those out. I've seen guys take this back piece off. I'm not sure it's necessary, but regardless. And then on the tack, it sits in there at a little different depth, and so I've seen guys that have needed to space this in order to get the correct pressure to hold the gauge in place and slide that back in. Doable if you have the time and the patience and you want to do it that way. I also didn't feel as though the finished product would look real clean, but again, it's behind your dash, you're not going to see it, so it's up to you. So what I'm going to be doing on my car is use these brackets that I made, and they're made out of 1/8 inch aluminum, CNC cut, and then they're tumbled for a nice smooth finish. Okay, so what'll come in the package is you'll get the bracket here. You'll get 4 little rectangular adhesive back pads. These 4 are some thread cutting screws over here, and this is M5 with some washers and a nylock for securing this back lip into the dash. This will be for a single gauge, and then you can also buy a pack of 2 that will allow you to do both 4.5-inch gauges. Okay, so now that we've got our bracket unpacked, we've already got the gauge slid out of the housing. Right here we have one of our new Speedhut gauges. This is one of the quad gauges, but I got to unthread this. I won't need this ring. Set that aside. So now that I got the gauge, you got the wiring that comes through the back like so. I'm going to take our new bracket and slide all your wiring through the opening that's in there. This, even on the quad gauge, is plenty of room to feed all your pigtails through. So, and then the bracket will actually slip over the back of your gauge like so. So the next step's going to be we're going to need to mark it, because I've found that trying to put holes in these for a set location wasn't really plausible, because I tried this on several different gauge setups and they were all a little bit different. So for me, doing it in drilling exactly where I wanted it was going to be a little bit better. So now that I have the housing here, I'm going to slip the gauge in. Well, reminder, I already have it in here, but reminder that you're going to want this piece back in. And when you drop it in, you're going to want to wiggle it around to make sure that it's all the way seated, because it can bind up in there. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slide the gauge with the new bracket in. And so at this point, I'm going to want to make sure there's a little notch right here. And I'm going to want to make sure that this bracket on the back is centered in that notch. And once I make sure that it's centered in that notch, I'm going to firmly press against it. It has a little bit of play here. So I don't want to go too crazy, because we're going to put the little foam pads in there just to make sure it's extra snug. But you want to make sure it's firmly seated in there. Then the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take your Sharpie, and there's two holes. There's a hole that's closer to the face of the gauge. We're not going to use that one. The one that's further back. And the one that's further back, I'm just going to put a little mark with my Sharpie. Going to do that on all 4 of these. Then once that's done, the gauge in the bracket, slide back out. I'm going to take the pigtails back out of our bracket here. Then from where we marked with our Sharpie, I'm just going to come along and center punch them. And you could use, I have a spring-loaded center punch that I'll actually mark them with. And you can use just a regular punch or drill freehand, but I find that, I mean, I guess you can put it in a drill press too, but I find that using the center punch and then just a cordless drill works pretty well, keeps it from running. I'm using a 7/64 drill bit to drill these holes for the thread cutting screws, which are these little guys, kind of hard to see. Thread cutting screws. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these center punched and get them drilled real fast. Okay, now that I've got the holes all drilled, I'm going to then use these foam pads that they have adhesive back paper on them, and you peel that off, and then I'm putting them perpendicular to these legs, not right up against them, inset maybe 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. Location's not real critical on these. They're just there as a cushion for the back of the gauge against the bracket. One, to help keep it nice and snug against the housing, and two, just in case you maybe didn't get it quite snug enough with those holes that you drilled, it wouldn't cause any vibration down the road. So, got our little foam pads in there. Now I'm going to slide this guy back together. And now you notice that I wasn't really worried about the orientation of the gauge when we drilled the holes, because as far as the bracket was concerned, that really didn't matter. What mattered is getting this leg lined up with the opening here. So, however, once we actually secure this, we're going to want to make sure that your gauge is centered. So as you can see, our gauge is pretty crooked in there. It's not a big deal. I need to get the holes that we marked lined up, and then I'll take a look at the gauge and say, okay, well, this gauge is still pretty crooked. So then essentially I can slide this out the back, rotate the gauge in the opening or in the bracket, slide it back in, line it up with our holes, take a look, and then once I get this adjusted, then I'm going to use the thread cutting screws and secure the bracket. And so now that we put those foam pads on there, we're going to have to compress those foam pads in order for the gauge to, the holes in the bracket to line up with this outside housing. But then once we do that, it's going to be nice and snug in there. And here, just to show you so you're not watching video that's even longer, here's our gauge that speedometer and tach that is already in. You can see the screws. Here's our bracket on the back. You have the wires coming out. Here's our tab that's going to be for mounting to the back side of the dash. And I mean, it's in here nice and solid. It's not rattling. It's not shaking around. And so then in this, once we get to this place, then can put some more tape on here, so that way when you slide it back in, you don't worry about hitting these screw heads on the inside of your dash. Slide it back in, then you have the screw that comes up through the inside. You can secure that, and then what you'll do is you'll take the M5 and put the washer on it, slide it through the bracket on the dash, through this, then from there you'll put the washer on the other side, the nylock, tighten it up, and your gauge is in. Nice and clean, easy to do. This bracket's available from Skillard.com. Again, the gauges are 4.5 inch Speedhut. We don't sell Speedhut gauges or any of their products, but it's just what we're using in our project, and I know that they're popular with a lot of you guys, and so hopefully this will help you with that install. Okay, so far in the video we've been working with the prototype bracket, and so I just wanted to show you the larger hole opening here is actually going to be the product that you'll be receiving. Noticed here in the Speedhut gauges, they have a couple knockouts back here. Looks like 3 of them, so that way they can run the wires out. And so even though this one here is in the center, if I turn this gauge and look, it's not up and down. So I would then need to rotate it in order for the gauge to be straight up and down in the dash. And so that's why the ones you'll be getting will have this larger hole opening depending on the configuration in your 4.5 inch gauge. So like looking at this one, even though it's not coming out, you know, if it was coming out this hole, it'd be nice and centered on the face, perpendicular, whatever you want to say, but here you have it. It needs to come out over on the side, so that way the gauge is up and down correctly. So when you get yours, you'll have the larger opening. They'll look like this. Here we're looking at the gauges that are installed in the dash, and you can see that they got the brackets in there, and this one here is secured. It's in there nice and snug. This one is not. I just wanted to point out that when you do put the gauge in, slide it in from the front. I put the screw in the front side already, and it still has quite a bit of play in this, and it can rotate. I also noticed that at least on mine, from dash to dash, because I had 3 or 4 dashes that I was playing with, that these brackets tend to be tweaked in one direction or another. So depending on if yours are tweaked or not, you might need to adjust them. They're pretty easy to bend in order to get it to line up correctly with the gauge bracket. However, this one looks like it's in pretty good shape, and so this little tab back here lines up no problem. But just thought I'd point that out.